I'm not sure if I'm live. I think you're live. Amazing. Well, we are just doing it by the seat of our pants today. Welcome to today's episode of MicroConf on Air. I'm your host, Rob Walling. We've run into some technical difficulties today, which is why we're starting about 7 minutes late. Jessica, would you mind muting? I'm hearing an echo coming back. So if you have headphones, you can put those on or mute your speaker for now and grab some of those. Anyways, Jessica's in the background. We're trying a new piece of software called StreamYard because the package we normally use and we've used for well over a year is still isn't for some reason isn't functioning today. But every other Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern for like more than a year, 10 a.m. Pacific, we live stream for 30 minutes and cover topics related to building and growing ambitious SaaS startups that bring us freedom and purpose and allow us to value and maintain healthy relationships. We don't ask for permission to start companies. We build and ship real products that sell to real customers who pay us real money. And I'm going to cut to the chase because we are starting a few minutes late. Today, I'm really excited to be talking with Jessica Malnik. We are talking about building a content moat. Jessica is a content strategist and a copywriter for early and mid-stage SaaS startups. In addition, her writing has appeared on The Next Web, Social Media Examiner, SEMrush, Winter, and many other sites. She is at Jessica Malnik on Twitter. Before branching out and starting her own business in late 2018, she spent almost 4 years working for Dan and Ian of the Tropical MBA. They are friends of MicroConf and friends, of course, of Startups for the Rest of Us. And I'm happy to call them my friends as well. And she was the Dynamite Circle's community manager. I'm going to embarrass Jessica here because I have a quote from Dan Andrews. And the quote is, "I just wanted to say publicly how enormous of an impact Jessica has had around here, from our forum to our events, masterminds, the podcast to Dynamite Jobs. Jessica has had a hand in just about everything we do. And as a consequence, in countless DC businesses, it would be an impossible task to summarize her contributions." So that is the inimitable Dan Andrews talking about Jessica. And with that, I'd like to welcome her to the show. Jessica, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and for putting up with all the technical stuff. We've been wrangling for 15 minutes behind the scenes, but the show must go on, as we say. Thanks, producer Xander, for making a last-minute audible into StreamYard here. So as always, if you're watching this, please feel free to post questions either into the YouTube chat or into preferably into MicroConf on Air. I'm sorry, the MicroConf on Air channel of MicroConf Connect. If you're not part of MicroConf Connect, it's our more than 2,100 founder online community. It's a Slack community. It's free to join, microconfconnect.com. So Jessica, let's dive in to content marketing. I want to ask you about your content moat framework. And you talk about it as having 3 components, which I think of maybe as 3 legs of a stool: insight, community, and remixing. Can you walk us through, the content moat framework in your mind, and then how each of those components contribute to it?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at a lot of the most successful companies who do content marketing really well, almost all of them have 3 really core components. You have insight, which is what I would call like the content itself. And it's not just the content, but it's also thinking through things like positioning, having, something interesting to say. And it's not just about, sure, you want to optimize it for Google and for Bing and for other search engines, but you also want to have that like original insight or things that only your company or only people in your company can really add to that. Then you have community, which I kind of think of as like relationships and a distribution engine. It's how are you going to get the content out there to everyone else in there? And that might be through your own branded community, but it doesn't always have to be that. It a lot of times can be from being a super connector within your space. And then you have remixing, which is, in my experience, the part that's the easiest to do, but often the most likely to be overlooked, which is you create these for example, you create this amazing 5,000 word like content, guide or this ebook all about a very specific topic that's so tied to your business. And then you put it out there, and more often than not, crickets, or you see a small spike in traffic, or right at the beginning because you send it out on your email list or on social, but then you forget to re-optimize that later on. Sometimes it's in the form of updating old blog post, updating that post, in the future. That's a really big one. And pretty much every time I've done that with any of my clients, there's almost been an immediate spike back up in rankings for older pieces of content, or it's turning that ebook and turning it into a podcast episode, or taking, if you did interviews for an industry report, you can take those out and put them as audiograms on social or in blog posts, or you create a highlights post. And there's so many different ways that you can kind of maximize the content that you create so that you don't have to be on that content engine. And if you don't have 100 plus people like a HubSpot or a Drift, which I'm going to venture to say most people don't have, you want to be able to maximize the use of every piece of content that you create.
Yeah, I like that. There's 3 components. I want to dig into each of those. But I did want to weigh in on remixing, because this is something that we have only started to do over the last year or 2 with MicroConf and Startups for the Rest of Us specifically. We used to record an episode of Startups for the Rest of Us, and then we put it out with a transcript, and that was it. And over the past 12 months, I was able to bring on an assistant producer who has been able to slice and dice the episodes. I started recording video, first of all. And so now we have these nice little video snippets about a minute long that we put up on Twitter and Instagram, and the Startups Pod Twitter and Instagram accounts. And those are getting, on Twitter, there's about 1,000, is that right? About 1,000 followers. But given the retweets and the likes and whatever distribution, we're getting north of 1,000 views of most of those clips, which is pretty neat, I think, to have that many people, sit and watch a little snippet we're doing. And then we're taking, at least with our listener questions episodes, where it's a really topical answer to something, we're taking those and we're going to start putting them on YouTube as, keyword focused snippets, right? With questions and stuff. So I'd love to get to the point where we also are there. And well, actually today I posted a Twitter thread, that kind of a tweet storm, that was one of the concepts I talk about in a recent podcast. And so the assistant producer, read through that, gave me a draft of it, and then I edited it and, posted it to my Twitter account. So those are multiple ways to repurpose it. I'd love to get to the point where we actually are turning concepts, because we introduce, much like Tropical MBA, we introduce our own frameworks, and own concepts that really should be blog posts. They should be written down somewhere, but I'm not yet at the point where I have someone, who can take that and put it together, and I don't have the time to do it myself. So are those some pretty common remixing approaches you've seen, or is podcast and video, are those kind of, more unique?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at any piece of content and giving any specific example of, if it's a podcast episode, like I know there are services that will take a podcast episode and turn it into a bunch of other content assets, but any sort of thing where it's a podcast episode can turn into a blog post. A lot of times, like if you have a really meaty podcast episode that's an hour and a half in length, and maybe you talk about 3 things, spin it off as 3 different angles. Don't just publish the transcript. There's certainly a place for that, but you can spin it off into 3 different, 2 or 3 different blog posts. You can splice it up into like little audiogram clips and share them on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok, if that's where your audience is. There's so many different ways you can go about it. And I often find one of the best things you can do is create a checklist, so that when you format and upload your post, whether it's on WordPress, Ghost, or whatever software, or Webflow, or whatever software you use, have a distribution checklist at the same time that you have your formatting checklist. So you can be like, here are the little tidbits of things that you should do right away. Like share this on Twitter, share this on Facebook, and then you can be like, schedule at the same time, share different things. Or to your point before, talking all about Twitter threads, or maybe do an Instagram story. There are so many different things you can do to maximize the use of that content. It doesn't just have to be within that month that you first publish it.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other example with MicroConf especially is we have, all these talk videos from more around 200 talks that folks have given over the years. Well, now we're north of that with our remote events, but we have been, by popular demand, actually, we've been taking the audio, those are on YouTube for anyone to watch for free. And then we take the audio of them and we put them on a podcast with an intro and outro that has been gaining steam as well. So that's another way to just turn one medium into another. I want to take a step back and talk a little about insight, which is really the content that you're creating. Again, as a reminder to folks, the 3 components of your content moat framework are insight, community, and remixing. And we've talked a little bit about remixing already, but insight involves, I think you have 4 elements of that: point of view, Do you have something unique to add? Depth, are you covering it comprehensively? Search intent, does the content you're creating match the intent behind the keyword? And positioning, are you clearly conveying why your brand is tied to the topic or conversation at hand? So I feel like point of view is pretty self-explanatory. It's like if it's plain Jane, vanilla, boring, not super interesting, it's like have an opinion on it, right? And then depth is like go deep with it. But I want to touch on both search intent and positioning, get your take on it. With search intent, do you always think about content in terms of it being keyword focused, or is there a time to write content that it isn't going to have many searches in the future? I'll give you an example. Like I have a post that is read often. It's called the stair-step approach to bootstrapping. No one was searching for that term, so there is no search intent, but I came up with the framework, I published it, and then have talked about it enough that people now search for it. Do you see that happening often, or is it more, is kind of the 90-10 use case, the 90% is you really should have some type of keyword intent for content that you're creating?
That's a really great point. And I would say in general, when it comes to content marketing, SEO can always be a really big lever that you can pull, but it's just one channel. When it comes to content marketing, there are so many reasons, so many other examples like the stair-step approach where it's much more thought leadership content, or if you have a very, very product specific sort of angle or post, or you're trying to popularize a framework. For example, another example that would be like what HubSpot did, popularizing the term inbound marketing or something like that, where there was no search intent at that time, just like there was no search intent with stair-step approach until you coined the term. So things like that, like content marketing is still extremely valuable. Maybe you're not looking at it from search intent, but that's absolutely a really key component of like having something interesting. Like I thought about content having something interesting to say, and then if you're wanting to use SEO as a lever, which in my experience about 70% of content tends to fall into that lever, then you want to also make sure that the keyword that you're targeting for that term, you're writing a post that's interesting, that's positioned well first, and then optimize it for Google to make sure that the keyword that you're targeting also has the same search intent.
Very, very nice. Before we bounce back to positioning, which I do want to cover, we have a listener question, and it is from Kevin Count on YouTube. I wonder if is there supposed to be you there, producer Sandra? It might be Kevin Count. Sorry, I apologize. No, it's Kevin Count. Okay. How do you go about writing content? Do you have a specific process?
Absolutely. Great question, Kevin. In general, when it comes to content, and this actually bounces back to your point, Rob, about positioning as well, like 80% of the content comes in the form of the content brief, the positioning, and the outline. If you can nail the content brief and the outline and the position, then the writing is the easy part, in my experience. And that's about 80% of the time. Once you do that, then it's about writing the post, editing it, and then utilizing and then uploading it and going through the distribution checklist that I mentioned above.
Do you have the distribution checklist? Have you published that on your blog anywhere?
I don't think I have, but that's a really good idea, and I will 100% publish that after this.
Awesome. And then we'll link it up somewhere, probably in our Slack, microconfconnect.com. If you have additional questions for Jessica, please chime in. I want to flip back to what I was about to ask, which was positioning. This is under your insight thing about positioning. Are you clearly conveying why your brand is tied to the topic or the conversation at hand? That's interesting. I find this really interesting because I've seen some companies, actually a lot of companies, that they do stuff that's so top of funnel that they don't necessarily tie it to their product. So an example might be if I had a help desk, like email customer support SaaS, like a Help Scout, right? Or a Groove. I could have a blog post that's, why email support is critical for SaaS companies, or like really top of funnel stuff. What is email customer support? Just kind of defining terms. Is that a bad thing to go that top of funnel? And I guess tying in with the positioning in a post like that, should I then make sure that I have a sentence or a paragraph that talks about how, Help Scout or Groove or my tool interacts with that?
Great question. And this is kind of a really big pet peeve of mine. In my experience, especially for content marketers who maybe haven't been content marketers for very long, they tend to go extremely top of funnel, and they go off of those really big top of funnel keywords. And while that's educational and you might convert people down the line, it could take 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years. It's a very long-term play. In my experience, a better approach is to start, especially if you're new to content marketing, especially if you're doing content marketing for the first time, or you've only been doing it for a few years, start bottom of funnel. Go off those bottom of funnel keywords where you're talking about people who are already problem aware. So in the case of, going back to the Help Scout example, you might want to publish case studies, or you might want to publish a comparison page where it's Help Scout versus Groove or Help Scout versus Georgius. I'm probably butchering that name. Or doing content like that that's very bottom of funnel specific, or even talking about very specific product use cases, and then working your way back up to middle of funnel content, and then finally doing top of funnel once you've kind of gotten that meat of your product led bottom of funnel content done first.
Very nice. We have another question. How often do either of you, from Janet Carr, I believe, if producer Andrew's done typing, Janet Carr, how often do either of you, my monitor just blanked out. How often do either of you publish content? Does the schedule matter for adjacent channels like SEO?
Great question, Janet. I would say in general, you want to have some sort of consistency, but there are some SEO agencies that will tell you should publish all the time. I tend to view in the line of be consistent, but also publish things when you have something interesting to say. So in general, if you can only commit to one post a month, do it consistently once a month instead of trying to post and burst where you publish 7 things all in a 10-day time period, and then you don't publish anything for 3 months. That could actually impact you. But if you're as long as you're consistent, that's all that matters, and that also that you're sharing things that are actually interesting.
Yeah, I think about it with I think there's value in both frequent touch points. And that's why I've recorded a podcast every week for 11 years, right? Startups for the rest of us. And that's why we do MicroConf on Air every 2 weeks, because it's frequent and it's something we want to be top of mind for folks. Then I think about these longer form, almost, whether it's pillar content or skyscraper or just, some big thought leadership piece. And I don't, you kind of can't do one of those a week because they take with our resources, right? They just take so long and they take so much effort to produce. So if you're doing one of those a month, I think you're, doing quite well. And twice a month would be amazing, right? And again, like you said, if you had 100 people on your team, well, you can do one of those a week, but most people watching this are not going to have that. So I think about cadences as different things. Recording a podcast for me these days is not a big endeavor. It's less than an hour of effort. Creating a massive piece of 5,000 word pillar content with an infographic and all the accompanying things is dozens of person hours, right? If not more than that. So I think you have to kind of weigh that out. I want to touch on, or do you have any thoughts on that before we go?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great point. I would also say that's also where remixing comes in. Because if you do spend the 10 hours or the 20 hours to produce that, massive pillar page, milk that out and actually turn that into smaller blog posts or social media posts or, podcast episodes that can make it seem so that you are showing up and having that a higher frequency, but you're not necessarily having to produce a 20, hour pillar page every single week.
All right, makes sense. Let's touch on community because it's that third piece of the content moat framework. We've talked about insight and remixing, but you talk about how community is how you can 10x your content distribution efforts. What are some ways to get your community to champion your content?
Absolutely. It first of all depends on, if you're in a place that you can either build a branded community or you're thinking about starting one, that's always going to be a massive, that actually becomes, not only a content mode, but a community mode at the same time. Realistically, not every SaaS company is going to have a branded community. Some should never have it. And others, it's a big time commitment. That is my background is community management. It takes a ton of time, and realistically, it does not. It could probably take a full year, if not a little bit longer, till you probably really start to see the ROI from that result. So, for example, if I have an early stage SaaS company and I sell, I help cleaning companies with like scheduling out their workers or something like that. That might not be a big enough space to have a full branded community. However, you can kind of utilize community principles and be the super connector, whether it's making those intros when you hear that one of your customers has a specific pain point, connecting them and playing that introductory role, or creating a really cool content guide or a spoke article or a podcast episode that helps address the problem. Things like that can go a really long way. And over time, you become seen as a super connector. And suddenly your content gets a lot more reach. And you also probably realistically are going to get a lot more customers from word of mouth.
Yep. And I think there's ways, I think of audience and community as two different things. They can be the same, but you can have an audience. Like back in the day, I had 10,000, 15,000 people reading my blog, but really none of them knew each other. So I would not call that a community, right? Just in my parlance. Versus MicroConf, these days is much more of a community because people meet in person, they meet online, they meet in Slack and Connect. All that said, I think that the more you offer to your audience or community, and the more you are able to provide them with value, we found that people are really quite willing to share, high-end content that we create. Like when we've had the big ask of, hey, we just wrote this big, kind of white paper that we researched and we put numbers into it. And, it's a 5,000 or an 8,000 word PDF. And we're on Hacker News right now. And we're also on Indie Hackers, and we're on this Reddit. And here's this thing for free. You've already opted in. Here's an email, we'll send to everybody. We found pretty good results from that. We don't do it that often because that content is just so hard to create, but we've had really interesting results from asking our audience / community to help with that. All right.
It's the whole adage of give more than you take.
Yep, that's right. I find that, like, of all the value that I put into the world, like a small portion of that comes back to me eventually, and that's all you really need. So, okay. So what are some tools that you use to identify the best content ideas for your moat, for you or your client's moat?
Absolutely. Of course, the answer is it's going to depend based off of the industry, the vertical, the stage of the business, and what their goals are. But if it's for an SEO, let's say, for example, it's someone who's looking to maximize their organic reach and grow via organic search traffic, the first thing I like to do before I do anything else is I start at the bottom of the funnel. I think I mentioned this before, where it's, okay, what are who are the customer, who is the ideal customer? Who's the best customer? What's the positioning? What are their goals, pain points, problems? What are all that stuff? And starting to map out bottom of funnel content, whether that's case studies, whether that's comparison, guides, articles, whether that's very specific product things that I do key goals and values. Once I have like a really massive list of content, then it's time to actually optimize it for SEO. Some of my favorite tools to use are Ahrefs, Phrase, and ClearScope, being three that have very different purposes. Ahrefs being for keyword search a lot of times. And then, of course, you get a lot of that stuff from your own, if you already are doing some through Google, can help out with automating content, some of the content brief stuff, as well as some post optimization. And then ClearScope's just a really cool tool, along with Phrase for that matter, for being able to optimize once it's written, being able to optimize it and make sure that you have that right right subheads, right H2s, H3s, and you're really optimizing it in a way without over optimizing it for Google.
Cool. You broke up a couple times in there. So let's run through the tools. We don't have to describe what they do again, but Ahrefs for keyword research, Phrase, what does that do?
Phrase is a tool similar to ClearScope in the sense where it does two things. One, it's really building out content briefs. It's also really good for once you have a post written, optimizing it for Google. And then ClearScope is a tool that's really good for post optimization once it's been written.
Got it. Okay. And was there a third tool, or were those the three? Phrase, ClearScope, and Ahrefs?
Those are the three that I use the most. There's also some really interesting tools in the AI space that I've been playing around with. One being Copy AI, another one being Conversation AI, that are both really good for giving you new ideas and brainstorming. I wouldn't necessarily use that to write your content, but it can be a really good starting point, especially if you suffer from writer's block.
Yeah, I saw Copy AI, the founder tweeted today that they hit 3,000 paying customers, I believe. So they're definitely getting traction. And then Market Muse is another one that I've heard about that I think is doing really interesting things in the key. It's AI copy, but they take it a level deeper. Like they've been working on this problem for years and years, and they do, it's a lot of SEO and organic stuff tied into that. So, all right. Last question we're a couple minutes beyond 30 past the hour, but we started a little late. So last question, and then we'll wrap up. What, in your opinion, is the most impactful spend you can make when it comes to content? Is the answer once again, bottom of the funnel?
That is a great question. I would say in general, yes, it would be bottom of funnel content, especially if you've been doing content marketing for less than a couple of years. After that, it's invest in your processes. Build out all of your processes when it comes to how you hire writers, how you onboard any sort of editors, how you handle uploading content, what you look for, building out your style guidelines. Because once you actually have a substantial amount of content, it's really about systematizing it so that it runs like a content machine. And then it allows you to be able to scale and be able to grow and be able to grow your content engine and generate more traffic, more leads, more customers. But really at the first stage of that is bottom of funnel content and building out your processes.
Amazing. Jessica Malnik, thank you so much for joining me today. If folks want to follow you on Twitter, you are at Jessica Malnik. That's Malnik. And really was a pleasure chatting with you today. Hope we can have you back on at some point again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. As we roll out, we don't have any theme music today because we are, as I said, rolling in a new piece of software that we had to switch to last minute. Thanks to Jessica for joining me. Thanks to producer Xander for making this happen. I think a lesser producer would have just given up and curled up into a ball and started crying, but producer Xander quickly got us going here in this alternative piece of software so that we could get the live stream to you, just like we promise every other week at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Thank you so much to Hey and Stripe for being longtime headline partners with MicroConf. If you haven't tweeted out to @Stripe or @HeyHey, it's HUI, and thank them for supporting MicroConf, I'd really appreciate it. It would be a nice favor to me. And they've just been, again, longtime supporters of ours, and they help make independent SaaS companies and mostly bootstrap SaaS companies, help us serve them better. If you haven't already, head to youtube.com/microconf and hit the subscribe button to get notified about all of our future live videos. And with that, we will wrap it. And I'll see you again in 2 weeks, if not sooner. Thanks so much for joining us.